call this house to order. Welcome to the grand finals of De La Salle Worlds. On the motion that this house supports nationalism, I'd like to call on the Prime Minister to speak on the motion standing in his name.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute pleasure to speak for Monash University on the opening government for the 5th consecutive World's Grand Final. And we're particularly excited at this moment because this is a topic which we entirely believe. The nation-state, ladies and gentlemen, is an artificial concept, but it's a beneficial concept. At Monash, we're going to prove two key things to you. Firstly, that the nationalism and the nation-state has more benefits than harms. And secondly, we will show you that nationalism is superior to alternative conceptions of collective identity, such as class, such as religion, such as sexuality, if that does exist. But it's also superior to no collective identity, ladies and gentlemen. Those are the key premises we're going to be advancing at opening government. We're not going to be comparing nationalism in this debate to a theoretical cosmopolitan utopia, because that simply doesn't exist. What we're going to do is look at nationalism as it exists now and compare it to other forms of identity as they exist right now. I'll have three key arguments at Prime Minister. Firstly, I'll explain to you why nationalism is a critical unifying framework. Secondly, I'll look at why nationalism helps promote essential sacrifice, which is crucial to the state. And thirdly, I'll look at how nationalism is the most inclusive framework of collective identity that exists. So firstly, why nationalism is a critical unifying framework. So what exactly do we mean by nationalism? We believe nationalism essentially is based on a belief in the strength and the power of the nation-state. It's premised on a few things. It's premised on reveling in specific commonalities, even though you have a range of other differences between other members of the state. It's based on supporting the collective endeavour of your country, their economy, their healthcare system, the education system. It's based on sharing a joint future which is ultimately based on cooperation, or if not cooperation, at least tolerance for the other members of your state, ladies and gentlemen. We of course recognise that the level of feeling associated with nationalism does not apply uniformly. We recognise that often in new states it takes time to develop that type of strong national identity which is so essential for all the benefits we believe in. However, we believe nationalism is something which does reinforce itself over time, because as more and more people opt into this, it's harder and harder to opt out of that shared collective identity. It's harder and harder to opt out of that common belief that your country is important, ladies and gentlemen. So why is this so significant? We believe it's absolutely fundamental for a population to succeed and to derive benefits. We say, ladies and gentlemen, particularly for countries riven by sectarian dissent, say hypothetically a country like Rwanda in the 1990s, the preoccupation with ethnic divides was incredibly corrosive. And the only way this kind of country could move beyond that is through a collective identity based on the nation-state, based on the recognition that the differences based on ethnicity, based on sect, ladies and gentlemen, are less important than the commonality of being part of the same nation. This is particularly important if you look at contexts, say, such as post-apartheid South Africa, ladies and gentlemen. We say for post-apartheid South Africa, it was so crucial to be able to unify behind the South African rugby team, a national team which represented every member of that country, ladies and gentlemen. That was absolutely essential to moving beyond these conflicts and recognising their limitations. Moreover, we believe that conflict often builds when nationalism breaks down. So when countries become riven by sectarian divides, like in Yugoslavia, once national identity becomes corroded, that's when the worst harms happen in terms of having collective identity and reduced conflict. I will take over.
Sir, but the problems are exacerbated at the point where nation-states feel as if they need to tie national identity to ethnic identity and cleanse anyone who is not a part of that national identity.
It's not our burden in this debate to defend extreme ethnic identities and polarizations within state. The key premise of our case is that nationalism, which is purely about commonalities, is the ideal that is most important for a harmonious and peaceful society. So second argument, why does this enhance the likelihood of sacrifice? We believe, ladies and gentlemen, human cohabitation relies both on trust, but also on a willingness to sacrifice for other members of your community. No, thank you. And that's because not all individuals have the same capacity to ensure that other members within their society are protected. So a good example of this is war, ladies and gentlemen. On the opening government, we don't always support war, but we recognise that it's sometimes necessary, whether because of resources, whether because of defending your country itself. We say when wars are necessary, they're more likely to have support within the country, more likely to be effective once you base this on national identity, ladies and gentlemen. We say when you make that difficult choice to go to war and risk your life, you have to believe in something that's worth risking your life for. We think it's absolutely fundamental to have that national identity, that national belief to power you to make that choices. That's much more likely than if your only identity is constructed around your religion, around your family, around your class, where you don't have any reason to actually mobilise for the collective well-being. That's harmful. This is important also in the context of public service, ladies and gentlemen. This is one of the key drivers for people to enter public service, to make sacrifices in terms of their pay, in terms of their conditions, and to work really hard to the benefit of their country, is when they believe they're sacrificing for something that matters. That occurs when that's based on this cohesive national framework that people want to sacrifice for, want to put this energy into. That's how you get all of those benefits through a national identity being constructed that's sturdy enough to power those kinds of sacrifices. So my final argument, ladies and gentlemen, is why nationalism is the most inclusive framework. We recognise, ladies and gentlemen, that there are other ways in which identity are shaped. We recognise that religion, like class, like social strata, ladies and gentlemen, are all significant ways in which individuals form bonds with other people. And some of them share the same benefits of our planet. The key difference with nationalism, ladies and gentlemen, is it's much easier to opt in and it's much easier to opt out. If you want to be part of a particular community, you can make that choice to live in that community or to move away from that community, ladies and gentlemen. You can't do that with something like religion or something like class, ladies and gentlemen, because other people within that class won't recognise your attempts to be part of that particular identity. So you have a greater capacity to actually be part of an identity and get that certainty and get the collective benefits that emerge from being that identity through nationalism, rather than through divisive identities like religion, which are much harder, both in terms of your internal recognition and in terms of the external recognition, ladies and gentlemen. This is both fairer and more harmonious. When you consider the huge movement of people from border to border, it's crucial to have identities which aren't constructed by immutable characteristics like your religion or your class. So, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that nationalism isn't perfect, but it's the best form of identity generation. It carries major benefits for the state. It's the most inclusive framework. We're proud to propose.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition.
Small, it's hilarious. Madam Speaker, at its core, national identity is but an imagined community. What we stand for on opposition is the idea that imagined value should not trump real benefits for yourself and for other people in society. While there may not be the cosmopolitan utopia, we think the general directions in which states have been moving in has been the idea that states that are divorced from identity are in better positions to provide meaningful benefits for their own citizens and to better cooperate with other states in the international community. We see that theocracies are often poorly suited to serve the interests of their citizens or to engage fruitfully with others precisely because they're muddying up the role of the state and the ideology itself. We say that we support a minimal state that's focused on enabling individuals to do things that they cannot do themselves, to provide for defense, to provide for individuals' defenses against each other, and to respect property. We don't think that the state should have a role in facilitating the creation of identity. The notion that that should be a standard for this round seems absurd. So before I get on substantive matter, we're going to talk about a few points of rebuttal. First, the idea that this is good because it's a unifying framework. First, we say this is an arbitrary heuristic, often one that comes at the expense of empathizing with other people, because you are a nation only insofar as other people aren't part of that nation, and there are a host of bad things that come about that as a result. They talk about this idea that it's good at supporting a collective endeavor. It's problematic because collective identities often struggle when there are instances when there's discord within other members who might want to claim they're part of that collective identity. That's when you have tensions which these systems are poorly suited to deal with. They argue that they're uniquely able to derive benefits by allowing for sacrifice. But insofar as some people need to sacrifice for the benefit of others, that often means that there exists some sort of difference between these populations of people. We think that to the extent that nationalism is predicated on imagining the sameness and the commonality, you don't often think that sacrifice is necessary to support others differently situated. We think the conclusion you draw is those people aren't meaningfully part of the same nation. So you're poorly suited to make the sacrifice necessary there. So when they talk about this idea that you're more likely to support, to successfully support wars, we flip it on its head. Because where nationalism becomes a primary guiding post of policy, you see more wars entered into that ought not happen. World War I is a good example of that. They argue that people can't look to identifying principles elsewhere, like class, like other things. We say that the state shouldn't be the actor that facilitates that role itself. They haven't shown you why that ought to be the state's burden to do so. They talk about why it's inclusive and thus easy to opt out. We say it's almost impossible to opt out when, one, the things that define what makes you perhaps part of one nation versus another may preclude you from moving across borders, may preclude you from calling yourself part of another nation, because being part of another nation involves some intractable feature which you do not happen to possess. That's a problem on their side of the house. So why do we think that nationalism detracts from cooperative outcomes that benefit all people? Because it hasn't come up in any other rounds at this tournament, I'm going to talk about the lottery of birth. So, what we say, Madam Speaker, is when we are born into community. We are born with certain characteristics, features, and born into cultures that we didn't choose, we didn't consent to, but those will meaningfully affect, within a nationalist setting, what groups we can call ourselves a part of. The idea that the preservation of these things, or the furtherance of these things that you never meaningfully opted into, ought to occur at the expense of tangible benefits, perhaps to yourself or other members within the state, is not justified whatsoever. What we also say is when you feel as though your national identity or your imagined identity is in conflict with what the state does, we think that you're less inclined to meaningfully engage with the state. So there isn't a real opt-out in that instance. You're not in a position to meaningfully measure your express your political rights as you would if this wasn't such an influential thing. Second thing I want to talk about, why we think that this can be abused in many instances. We believe that because nationalism is often a very visceral, very potent, very toxic sort of concept, it is often leveraged by politicians and leaders to get people to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do. When a dictator or a bad leader recognizes that a united population of people could stop him or her, often dividing people by fomenting different nationalist sentiments is nothing more than a means of propping up an illegitimate regime. We don't think that's a good thing. We think that sectarian interests often become a national cause, and when that ideology bleeds into an argument for how the political apparatus ought to be organized, that's when you see massive violence the world over throughout history. What we also think that is in public policy, these sorts of... Actually, pause. Over to you.
So you've offered no comparison with other forms of collective identity. Isn't nationalism one of the only ways to help dilute the worst impacts of ethnic and sectarian division?
So we think the basis by which you should choose what state you support, what state you live in, is how well that state provides goods that matter to you, or goods that are material, that benefit the population, like defense, like economic policies that allow you to start businesses and prosper, or welfare policies that are meaningful to help those who are less well off. These are substantive reasons to organize and prefer a state, not an imagined community. That's the comparison. There you go. Enjoy. We also think that this can be abused for foreign policy. Think of instances like India and Pakistan, Taiwan and China, where these sorts of identity politics are used to just foment anger within the population, periodically, which happens in times which happen to coincide with elections, or when politicians want to detract information from elsewhere. We don't think nationalism is good in the sense it creates a tool for politicians. We further say that public policy like immigration, things that from a material point of view would benefit society, when those are harmed by the presence of nationalism that doesn't serve the people, it doesn't serve the communities within them, it'd be better if we organize things differently. We're proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, and now I'd like to call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
Barack Hussein Obama said, "There are no black Americans. There are no white Americans. There are just Americans." That statement can only exist in a nationalistic society to believe in something other than those identities. That statement can only have meaning and unify people if there is a thing called America that is more than just borders, but is indeed a collective identity that people subscribe to and enjoy. Nationalism is good. First thing I want to look at, the harms that nationalism has been accused of. The first general class was, but nationalism is often used as an excuse for violence, like ethnic violence was the example given in a point of information. We think that examples of inter-ethnic violence are examples of failures of nationalism, not of the full function of the thing that we support. We think that when you hate someone else for being different from you, the best way, and in fact the only way to fix that, given that you can't change a lot of the differences between people such as race, is to find another immutable characteristic that you can all subscribe to cohesively. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the nation. But not just the borders of the nation, and not just the government, but the notion of the nation as a collective that supersedes you, that you want to contribute to, that you have an interest in thriving beyond you. That's when you don't hate people who are different to you, because they're actually all just Americans. We think that those differences are less likely to exist when nationalism actually is robust. And yes, nationalism does involve a certain amount of exclusion, right? If you are an American, that means by definition you think you're better than people who are not American. I assume it's Americans. But to the extent that all collective identities must be based on exclusion, why do we prefer nationalism? Because you can't change a lot of things about yourself. If you are black and people have formed an identity around hating black people, you cannot access that. But almost without any counterpoint, nationalism is accessible by all. You just have to subscribe to the values and to the concept of the state. You have to show patriotism and you can be a participant in it. You don't have to, right? You can be the least nationalistic person in a country. I might be the least nationalistic Australian because I don't like cricket. But I can. The avenues of entering into that collective are open to me where they might not be open otherwise. Secondly, what we heard is that wars are created by nationalism. Incorrect. Wars are created for security reasons, for the selfishness of individuals wanting resources, for the selfishness of individuals wanting to feel protected, or for the expansionary ideals of governments, right? But the question is, if a war does or does not happen, what is the best way for a community to be able to protect itself? And we don't think that it's for a minimalist account of the state where everyone is an atomized individual participant in the cosmopolitan mass. It is when you believe that a threat to Australia is a threat to you. That is the only way that you protect other people, and we think that sadly that is sometimes necessary. What we heard from opening opposition was, we think that certain characteristics are immutable and that nationalism is one. We disagree. You can choose to stop being a living member of a nation or even a nationalistic member of a nation, and that is a far less immutable characteristic than the ones that you are born with. Closing.
When nationalism invokes only one set of values, can't politicians suppress dissent by invoking that in political actions, like Bush did through the Patriot Act?
Yes, and then all of the counterpoints can say, actually, it's not American to, reduce freedom. In fact, it is thoroughly un-American. We think that there is a constant, vigorous debate about what that nation means, and that's why it changes over time. That debate is a good thing because it means public values are clear and they're constantly talked about, rather than just individuals talking about their own values and never, engaging with anyone else's. Second point I want to look at, the benefits of nationalism. What we heard in response to all the benefits that Kieran put to you was, from the opening opposition, those are actually just the benefits of the state, not the benefits of nationalism. The full functioning of the state needs nationalism to work. For people to cooperate with laws, they can't just believe that a police officer will arrest them, because there aren't enough police officers to arrest everyone. You have to have an interest in the order of the people around you. You have to have an interest in the thing that you live in, possibly even beyond your own life, beyond your own borders, and beyond that of your family, because you see that there is something that you do believe in there. Because if you like America, your children should like America, your neighbours should like America, and you have an interest in protecting America and complying with the laws. We think that other things like religion, other things like ethnicity, even sexuality, to the extent that does or could challenge the idea of nationalism one day, we think those are alternative directions. Those alternative directions of allegiance, other than the state, are actually the things that threaten the full function of the state. So if you can get lots of benefits from collectivisation, which was conceded, they said it's just provided through the state, we think that having an identity based on ethnicity weakens that state by creating an alternate source of allegiance, right, to your God, to a group of people, and not to the nation itself. We think that humans need to collectivise to thrive, and that nationalism is the certainty of that collective. It's the certainty of the collective you participate in and other people helping you. Those are the goods that matter to people that opposition leader was talking about. That's why the state offers those goods to people, because nationalism offers certainty in that. The final point I want to look at is a substantive point about the importance of belief in the state as a concept. If you value and believe in your state, if you love your nation, and importantly, if you conceive of your nation as having values and characteristics that you want to survive beyond your own life and beyond your own direct experiences, that is a good thing. Why? Firstly, because you're more likely to plan in the long term and believe and have an interest in the cohesiveness of that nation. Incidentally, that's the only way international commerce could function. Otherwise, no one would believe that a country would repay its loans, that a country would fulfill its treaty obligations, that a country would ever engage in commerce the same way tomorrow as it did today. But it does, because the nation state and the concept of nationalism has a direction forward through time. It has a certainty that comes when the collective believes in that certainty. We think that you only plan in the long term if you believe in the state, and we don't think you only believe in the state if you have a nationalistic attitude. But the second benefit of belief in the state is it reduces what I've called the tragedy of community commons. If you don't have an interest in America as a concept, then you have far less of an interest in politics, in laws, in actions that do not directly affect you and your family. We think that the idea of people going out of their way to protect others, we think the idea of people voting on anything other than their direct interests or the things that might interest them can only exist when you believe in a polity that is beyond your own. We think that belief in the state is one of the best benefits of nationalism. What has Monash told you in this debate? We've told you that it is not reasonable to compare nationalism to a utopia of cosmopolitan love for everyone, but compared to the other ways in which humans can and do collectivise, things like ethnicity, religion, sexuality, we think that nationalism is better. It offers benefits of altruism, belief in the state, longevity, and it is far more accessible than any type of collective identity. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that it is important that there is an America, not just a black or a white America.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
So clearly the American flag was ironic for the purposes of this one. I think it's interesting how Amit starts his speech with an ode to Barack Obama. Because while as inspiring as the quote about not a black America, not a white America, but the United States of America was, I think it would have been perhaps a bit more inspiring if he said, the world is composed not of black people, not of white people, but of people. People irrespective of national identity, people who, just because they happen to be called Canadian or Australian or British, are as deserving of rights, benefits, respect, and tolerance as everyone who is in the United States of America, whether black or whether white. That would have been the most inspiring narrative for him, for Barack Obama to have said. But unfortunately, because we live in a world in which politicians have to appeal to concepts like national identity, he wasn't able to say that. And the United States, despite having elected Barack Obama, still had trouble divorcing itself from nationalistic policies, see its continued presence in Guantanamo Bay, see continued political pressure on the Republican Party, by the Republican Party and the Tea Party to define American national interests in narrow terms and to only be involved in foreign countries for the sake of exploiting them for our national interests, irrespective of the welfare of citizens of other countries. That is the danger of nationalism. I want to clear up the ground in today's debate because while we clearly don't support strong national identities, we obviously exist in a world in which there are states. We think worlds in which those states move more towards collectives like the European Union and other forms of international organization that minimize barriers between states are good. We think that's the best way to achieve in the long run the type of cosmopolitan vision that may be impossible now, but in an ideal world, but not in a just world, but not be impossible. But we also recognize that things like religion, class, other forms of identity still exist. Here is the key distinction between the benches in this debate. What we say is that none of those other forms of identity, or any form of identity, ought to be the basis for organizing a state and distributing benefits within that state. I think it's interesting that Ferris talks to you about theocracies, and we never hear a response as to whether or not, if people within a nation decided that they wanted to organize on the basis of a religion and make that their national identity, they would be free to do so. Because while religious organization may be dangerous in terms of inculcating certain values within a community, you know what's much more dangerous? When you give the state apparatus, with its power to tax, punish, imprison, and invade other countries, the ability to use its religious views or other forms of national identity as the basis for the exercise of power, then you are exploiting people and denying people's rights on the basis of completely morally arbitrary characteristics, whether or not it's religion or whether or not it's another form of identity. First, a bit more rebuttal before I talk about the type of international community that we envision on our side of the house and how a world in which nationalism isn't the source of state identity, isn't the source of state power and state function, is a world in which individuals throughout society and throughout the world are better off. But first, a little bit about what Amit says. Amit talks about ethnic violence and saying that, well, ethnic violence is an example of people organizing along ethnic lines, not along national lines. No, Amit, ethnic violence is an example of people organizing on ethnic lines and using that as the basis to compete for a national identity. If you minimize the extent to which any identity, whether ethnic, whether religious, or whether arbitrary based on where you happen to be born, if you minimize the extent to which that allows the state to organize, then you decrease the legitimacy of any group of people that try to command national power, whether it's on the basis of religion or whether it's on the basis of ethnicity. No, thank you. The next thing that we hear from him is this idea that it's nationalism, while you may not be able to meaningfully opt out of it, you can more meaningfully opt out of it than you can religion. First, this just isn't true if national identity is defined by where you were born. You can't opt out of where you were born. You will then be discriminated against throughout the world on the basis of where you were born. He talks about Australian identity and liking cricket. Well, yes, you can come to like cricket. You know what's a much easier basis, though, to opt in and out of a society? Whether or not you like the government's tax policy, or whether or not you like the fact that Australia has a lot of minerals and want to live in a country in which you can invest significantly in mining. We think those types of preferences are much less morally irrelevant than the types of arbitrary situations in which people on the basis of the lottery birth, as Ferris tells you, are currently forced into a national identity and are currently forced into a set of political structures with decreased ability to move because they will consequently be discriminated against on the basis of those arbitrary characteristics as opposed to the choices they consciously make. Steph.
So in what way do you propose reducing the ways in which people define their other identities, that is to say, class, race, etc., and making those less salient despite their divisiveness?
Okay, we obviously believe that people will continue to organize along those lines. What we're saying, and this is a principal debate, is that states ought not organize and distribute power on the basis of any of those identities or of any other form of identity, particularly where you happen to be born. Any source of identity as the basis and legitimacy of national power, which is the philosophy that nationalism espouses, is bad. You can talk about all the other forms of identity that you want. All of those, when they lead to control over the state reins of power, are going to be harmful. The next thing I want to talk about, though, is Amit's point about how nationalism leads to an interest in your society, and that you're not going to have an interest in your society if you don't have a national identity around which to organize. We think this is silly. First, there's the obvious example of you live in the country and want benefits for yourself, your family, future generations. But much more importantly, we believe individuals are fundamentally good and altruistic. We think the reason why individuals want to help people in their country is because they see themselves as like those other people and want good things to happen to them. Nationalism arbitrarily limits that extent of that altruism by saying it ought to be constrained only to individuals with whom you happen to share this national identity, as opposed to the common humanity that we all share. This leads me to the point I want to talk about how changing and eroding the idea of nationalism increases the ability for countries throughout the world to better provide for their people. We think first and foremost in just really basic examples of idea like fewer wars started. Yes, maybe people are slightly less willing to join an army to defend themselves, although we don't think that's true because, well, you don't want to die and have your nation attacked. But more importantly, what we would say is that if you never have the basis of national identity in the first place, then you never have the desire for national glory, for the desire to expand your nation and increase your glory and the power of your people by conquering others. It's what led to Manifest Destiny and taking over the land of the Native Americans in the case of the United States, because we believed as a people that we deserved the land and we're better than them and we're entitled to it and needed it for ourselves. We think when you take away the construct of the nation state and just have a bunch of different political entities that provide benefits, individuals then don't limit their altruism to only those people with whom they happen to share this arbitrary national identity. They instead are more willing to extend it, whether it's via foreign aid, whether it's a desire not to attack their neighbor, in any of those meaningful ways. They extend it to people throughout the world. That leads to a more tolerant world, a more cooperative world, and ultimately one in which we all, people, are better off. We oppose.